Hello, you're listening to the HatchetJob.com gaming netcast, and today's show is an interview with a competitive eater and StarCraft 2 player called Johnnie Excel. And although StarCraft is mentioned briefly, and Johnny's very good, he's in the top 10 to 15% and heading towards the top 2%, it isn't the meat and potatoes of the show, pardon the pun. No, that's about competitive eating, its culture, its tactics, where it might go in the future. And really, it's just a kind of general back and forth discussion where I'm trying to find out more about the subject and trying to see if there is more to it than just people standing on a stage stuffing themselves with food. The reason I wanted to speak to you, Johnny, is, and I've kind of had my eye on your videos for a few months now, is after you finish eating, you narrate them, don't you?
Right, exactly. If I'm doing it competitively, I try to do a good speed. Performance is always measured typically by pounds per minute. And when I do stuff, I try to measure a good pound per minute, depending on the type of food and the texture and all that. But otherwise, the other objective, I guess, is just to enjoy it. Some challenges just actually taste good. And I do enjoy eating, and I do it for fun. Yes,
and in talking about pounds per minute, in what's great about your videos is that you'll actually talk about how if a dish has several components, you'll talk about which you eat first and then kind of the tactics behind them.
Right, exactly. There's a bit of a plan of attack on it.
It made me think, hold on a second, there's actually thought going into this. It's not just somebody stuffing their mouth with something. They're actually considering this as kind of an entity that they have to get through. And how are they going to attack it?
Right. Basically, in competitive eating, there's two aspects. One is capacity, which is just innate, how much food you can hold. And the other is always going to be technique. There's pretty much always the best way of eating something. Now, for instance, like hot dogs, you never just want to attack a hot dog straight on, bun and dog. You always want to separate it, and you dunk the bread separately. And that's been long tested and kind of established as the method to do it.
And of course, on your blog, you have an article there called, I think it's the analysis of a hot dog competition. And there's a really striking line in it, which I think will resonate with gamers, especially people of a competitive mindset, which is, there is no tasting competition, just procedure and logistics.
Exactly. You have to think about it objectively. Your goal in an eating competition isn't to taste food. You're not there to rate it or critique it. It's basically to put as much of that stuff inside your body as fast as possible. You want to do everything you can to do as good as a job as you can to fulfill that objective. So in that article I wrote is basically considering methods of things you can do. And I think, for what works, at least for myself, that has been what's been the best.
In that article, you actually break down the average weights of hot dog buns. You then talk about how different casings can affect how they're eaten and the speed at which they're eaten.
Right, of course. Textures, how hard you have to bite. I mean, that's really getting down into the math and science of it because, one, you want to compare hot dogs to hot dogs. If one competition uses a different one. Because one of the big things in competitive eating is comparing hot dog numbers. It's kind of like the most consistently eaten competitive eating food. So if you say one hot dog competition, they eat 50 hot dogs, another one they eat 40, but they're different sizes, right? Let's say the hot dog's 40 grams and another one's 60. There's a big difference as far as total amount of food you've eaten.
Do you go into that kind of detail on other things, or is hot dog a good baseline because there are fewer components to compare?
Hot dog is the most popular and it is the baseline because it's the biggest event. In America, we have the Nathan's once a year hot dog eating competition in Coney Island, New York. That's tradition. It's been going on for decades now. And it's what everyone sees when they say, oh, eating competition. You mean like the one they show on ESPN where those guys are eating hot dogs? Well, yeah, that's the competition everyone knows about. And as far as prevalence, it's everywhere because it's so cheap. It's a very inexpensive food everyone can relate to because you can go down the street, go to a hot dog stand and buy a hot dog for a couple bucks,
Did Nathan's capture it because they happened to sell hot dogs and so they were the first ones to sponsor it? Or is it that it caught on because, as you say, this is a food that everybody can relate to? So in the same way that we have the hamburger index in economics to discuss how expensive a Big Mac is in China or whatever.
Exactly. The hamburger index is probably a good way of referring to it because, well, Nathan's purpose is their marketing. They're not just a hot dog manufacturer. They have restaurants. So they're getting the exposure, and they have a contract with ESPN. The guys who put on that contest are the MLE. They're actually an organization who has all these eaters in a group who they have signed contracts with. And they provide the talent, per se, for this competition, while Nathan's is a sponsor, and they provide the food and the exposure.
So MLE stands for, is it Major League Eating?
That's correct. Now, in America, there's a big, or at least in the competitive eating scene, there's kind of a big controversy because as the years have gone by, they've gotten very strict. The people that sign contracts with the MLE can't participate in sanctioned or non-sanctioned events. So if they just want to go to a restaurant to do a man versus style food, eating challenge, I can't eat a 5-pound burrito because I signed a contract. I've had friends leave it, and some people join because I'm in the independent scene. That's pretty much you can do whatever you want. There's a lot of big competitions outside the MLE. They have their circuit, they have their competitions, and they don't consider anyone professional outside of it. But skill-wise, there's great people on both sides of the wall. The biggest controversy regarding this was Takeru Kobayashi. 3 years ago, he left MLE, and he tried to get on stage during the last contest outside of the contract. But since he didn't have a contract, he couldn't compete anymore. And he's the guy from Japan who broke the record a few years ago, early 2000s, and set a really high number. And they had him arrested because he couldn't compete. A lot of people were trying to push for him to compete. He's probably the most well-known, at least throughout the world, competitive eater.
So he's this kind of slender, he's a slender, young-looking Japanese dude, isn't he? He doesn't look bulky. He doesn't look like he can pack it away.
He used to be a bit of a bodybuilder. I think one time he was up to like 195 pounds. I think now he's probably like in the low, like 130, 140. He's not big. I mean, standing next to him, he's probably, I'm like 5'10". I would say he's probably like 5'6". So he's a little guy, but he has the record for putting away the most hot dogs.
Have you heard the phrase hollow legs?
Right. Well, that has nothing to do with your GI tract, but yeah, that would be an advantage if you could somehow do it.
Kind of going back a second to talk about hot dogs. Now, when we look at competitive eating videos or at yours, what tends to happen is, because you are an independent, and so a bit like the UFC has their fighters, and then you have smaller events and like freelance fighters.
Right.
You can go to restaurants, and there's you eating hamburgers and enormous sashimi rolls and all sorts of different stuff.
Right, exactly.
And it struck me that all of these dishes are regular food. Okay, so there's nothing remarkable about them, but in large amounts.
Exactly. It's. I mean, they try to be pretty ingenious with the construction, and I've actually experienced a couple that have been just really great tasting. I've also experienced some that are just totally ass, like the now defunct B3 burrito in Las Vegas. The restaurant closed down, but that was the worst tasting challenge food I've ever had because they were declaring that it's 6 pounds, and based on my own metrics, it was easily 8. But they used the cheapest ingredients. It wasn't even a thing you could create at home and make it taste that bad. It was canned nacho cheese, canned jalapenos. It was just the most awful quality. But, that's when I turned off the tasting and I just had to power through it just to finish it, just for the sake of the challenge. Conversely, there's been foods where it's been a shame to eat so quickly. I'm a sushi, Japanese food kind of nut. And that sashimi bowl I ate in LA was terrible to eat so quick because I just wanted to sit there and savor it because I really wanted to examine each flavor profile for the fish. And there's about 20 different types of sashimi on top. But it's a shame, because you're doing it for time, you're doing it for YouTube, you're doing it just to get a good number out. So
I was going to ask, that's actually prompted 2 questions for me. The first one is, have you ever gone to a competition where the things that they've presented to you have been constructed especially for competition? So it's not for a dish. So, for example, when we talked about how you analysed food beforehand and the order in which you'd eat ingredients, have you ever been given a plate or something which is been designed to be a challenge in terms of tactics and not necessarily technique?
The only thing that I could actually consider like that was because most food is food. It's things people enjoy eating, hot dogs, hamburgers, burritos, whatever, is when they try to make you eat incredibly spicy food. Because a lot of people don't consider that because they have a jalapeno contest here in Texas once a year, and the record's like over 300 jalapenos. That's not a normal meal. You won't consider just eating straight jalapenos to be a thing.
Yeah.
There's also this one I did in Newport Beach that had a habanero burrito. Basically, it was a regular standard size, maybe 8-ounce, 10-ounce burrito, but it had like 4 or 5 habanero peppers inside of it on top of the normal fillings. And, I had to eat that quickly. That was excruciating. I won that. I ate the entire thing in like half a minute just because it's only like 8 ounces of food. but I'm stuffing like 4 or 5 habanero peppers down my throat. And you're grabbing fire for days after that. But
I was actually going to ask you, and I didn't know whether I should, but I'm sure lots of people listening to this are going to want to know about the aftermath of a competition.
Consider the day. I don't know if you guys really have buffets and stuff. I'm sure you have something where it's all you can eat meals over there. Just pretend like you just went to one of those. You sat there and stuffed yourself to the gills. And you pretty much feel drowsy. And that's pretty much the same feeling that you would get. I mean, it's just, you feel stuffed. You eat 10 pounds of, okay, you're not going to eat probably 10 pounds. You probably eat, average person, if they go to a buffet, I would say probably eats 2 or 3 pounds of food, which is decent.
Right.
And that's it. You'll feel full. I mean, I feel full eating just one hot dog and satisfied with it, you know. The only reason I keep eating is because I can.
How did you get into this? What is the tipping point where between a punter who says, man, I can eat a lot, I can eat 6 pounds if I go to a buffet, and the punter who thinks I can actually do this professionally?
I think for myself, and I could probably attest to a lot of others who end up getting into this, it's you kind of stumble into it.
Right.
My first competition was in 2009. Basically, I heard, you know, there's this big contest on the West Coast. They're offering $10,000. You just have to eat hot dogs for 10 minutes. So for me, I've always liked eating. So I was like, okay, worst case scenario, I go to a place and eat for 10 minutes and get free food. There's a win-win regardless, and there's money involved. I ended up going there, no training or anything, and I ended up placing third, which still entitled me to $500. I basically just showed up, ate food for free, and got free $500. And a couple pros were there, and those guys asked me, you know, how long I've been doing it, have I been training, and I hadn't been. You know, it's in there cold. Now, if you actually went and prepared, I probably would have fared much better and maybe even placed higher than I did. But, you know, you just kind of realize you have this skill. And then finding out that people are willing to pay you money or give you free food just because you can eat a lot, it was a very reasonable and I guess logical decision.
Yes, I mean, you kind of sort of heard heavenly trumpets playing as you lifted a hot dog to your mouth and then looked at the check on the wall or something, I guess it's...
I mean, okay, let's put it this way. I'll write you a check for $1,000 if you eat 50 hot dogs.
Sign me up.
You know, I'll give you the hot dogs for free. You just have to eat them. That's it. How can you refuse? Your worst case scenario is you're going to have a stomachache from trying to eat 50 hot dogs. And even then, that's not too bad. If you enjoy hot dogs, pretend it's your favorite food.
Yeah.
For me, if it had been a sushi competition, I'd sign up even if it was for free. If there was no reward, because the food itself is the reward.
There are kind of 2 dishes which I really like, which are Chinese dishes, which I would happily eat mounds of for nothing, right?
What do you like?
Crispy pork and roast duck rice. So this is cold, like fatty belly pork with a crunch on top.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
Roast duck and hot rice. Right. And then yao nam noodle soup, which is beef brisket with a kind of aniseedy taste and a thick stock.
Oh, okay, I know what you mean. I live near Chinatown in Philadelphia. My girlfriend's Taiwanese, so I eat a lot of Chinese food, and I wish they would come up with more Chinese food or Asian food eating contests. There's just, and it's a bias, of course. It's a cultural bias for me, but I wish there was a lot more of that. I mean, the fried rice that you're describing just sounds amazing.
So this is quite interesting. We're talking about cultural biases. Now, I was watching a program on the BBC the other day, which has a guy called Ken Hom, who's an American cook. He's in his 60s now, Chinese, ethnic Chinese, and an ethnic Chinese English woman who's also a cook, and they were going back to China to see how it had changed.
Right.
And Hom said that, talking about the panoply of crazy things that Chinese people eat, Hom said that his mother actually thought that Western food made her uneasy because we eat big slabs of meat.
Yeah, they don't eat as much in the Chinese tradition. I've come to experience that because I actually wasn't born in the United States either. I was born in the Philippines. I immigrated here in the late 80s. And, I've kind of had both sides of it. I've had the cultural experience from eating stuff we eat over there and then the stuff over here. Like over here, there's Western food, there's fried chicken, there's hamburgers and stuff like that, which I've never really experienced, especially fried chicken. And then it's weird that when Americans find that you eat strange things, like we'll have like a pork blood soup or something, they just think it's the craziest thing in the world. And in British food, anything with blood that you guys use, like the liver sausages and blood pudding and stuff like that, Americans actually find really, really repugnant.
It's quite weird. I mean, it's totally black. We call it black pudding here. So in America, you call it blood sausage. It's black pudding here. It's totally normal. In fact, kind of the classic English breakfast, like the full English, will be eggs, bacon, sausages, beans, black pudding, tea, and toast.
Right.
And that, it's like it's black pudding is one of the legs of the stool. You can't take it away without affecting the whole thing.
Exactly. It makes a lot of sense because, that's the culture. And it's a good part of the animal. Blood is actually one of the tastiest bits. If you cook it right, it's great. I love the blood soup that we have in the Philippines. But American palates tend to, think it's strange. They can't absorb other culture. But I would probably say that we're probably more open than a lot of other cultures in that respect, too. Like you were saying that Chinese mom was saying American food is weird because we eat big slabs of meat. But we have a lot of fusion and integration since, America is a very multicultural country. We have everything. I mean, I'll walk down the street. We have a marketplace. We can order Middle Eastern food and Asian food and all sorts of different types of cuisine from Europe. And it's wonderful, I could have a falafel with like a Belgian waffle.
a cheesesteak falafel, a Philly falafel. I think that would... And
it's nice because, you kind of have a mixture. It turns into a really unique amalgamation of just foods. And it's nice because I think that's how food evolves when you go through history. You look at epicenters of culture, the cross posts for trading roads. Those are like foods end up developing and tastes come out, like the Middle East back when the trade was really popular there.
It's interesting that you bring up history because I think it's important that we give some context to this general discussion about competitive eating because I would forgive people, I don't know if you would forgive people for them thinking that perhaps this is kind of a crazy Western decadent American thing, like kind of piling food into your mouth. But actually there is a historical precedent for it because there's in Norse myth, or at least in one Norse poem, a fire giant actually has an eating competition with Loki.
Right.
Then there's a Greek play, I think, and I assume it's an ancient play, where Heracles, aka Hercules, has an eating competition. And then if we fast forward, North American tribes in Canada and America had an event called a potlatch, where they used to get together. And I've actually did some cursory research, and I've got an interesting quote from this. This is a quote from a book called In Anthropology and Religion, What We Know, Think and Question, by a guy called Winsler. And he's talking about an American anthropologist called Marvin Harris. And apparently this is kind of a paraphrase of Harris talking about this feasting event. He said the objective of a potlatch was to achieve high status and renown by outdoing rivals in the quantities of food consumed and property given away, and in some cases destroyed. And I think this is where the term potluck comes from, the potluck dinner.
That makes a lot of sense.
So here's kind of a tactical question for you. So let's say you're in charge of competitive eating, and your mission is to kind of move it from the sideshow to the stadium. How would you challenge those cultural boundaries so it isn't a Western thing, it is an event that is actually perhaps has a root in all sorts of cultures? How would you export it to the Philippines? How would you export it to China?
Well, there's actually a bit of prevalence. I would say, Americans are by far the most notorious for holding eating competitions. But there actually has been a long, and not surprisingly so, history of it in Japan as well. People have had eating contests, and there's actually a difference in style because Japanese eating contests tend to be longer, over like an hour, whereas Americans are like short, 5 or 10 minutes. I mean, that's where Kobayashi came from. Takeru Kobayashi started off in Japan. They did all these eating shows. They actually had television programs where people would do eating competitions almost like game show style. You see the wacky Japanese game shows. These guys would just eat foods on stage, and they take it seriously.
Is America all about the shock value of the speed, and Japan is all about endurance marathons, or what? Why is there that difference?
I think it's just more of a style difference, honestly. I mean, why did certain fashion trends originate the way they do? I just think it's just a certain way of eating it. Now, in America, we have by far the most eating challenges. Ever since that Man vs. Food came on there, it's kind of highlighted as something that's existed in restaurants for a while, is that, we'll give you free food if you eat a lot. But I think more importantly, rather than to distinguish Western competitive eating culture from Eastern competitive eating culture, is that this sort of thing happens, and to tie to what you were explaining about the potluck story in first world cultures. The countries that end up doing this are the ones who have the decadence or the means to. Obviously, if you're in Somalia, you're not going to be holding eating competitions because there's just not the resource available to do so.
But in countries like Japan, the United States, and even Britain, Canada, and the rest of Europe, countries that actually have the money where people can afford to get fat and eat a lot can afford to, put on an eating contest because we have the resources. We can just go down to the grocery store, buy 500 hot dogs and host a contest this weekend on a whim,
If you could build some kind of piece of clothing built for competitive eating, what would it look like? Would it look like a funnel that goes above your head and just points at your mouth, or would it be a suit that you cover yourself in hot dogs, or what?
Not really. I guess the only considerations would be posture. For me, I'm kind of tall compared to some of the other eaters, and sometimes I have really low tables, so it ends up hurting your back if you're having to bend down so much. My buddy Stephanie Torres is this little Mexican girl. She's like 5 feet tall, about 100 pounds. And she has this unfair advantage where her face is literally like just a little bit above the table. She doesn't have to bend over to reach the food. And she eats immensely. She's very impressive in her metrics. But, there's that logistics. So if you had some kind of clothing that can kind of hold you up, perhaps, and definitely having stretchy pants. I like wearing I have this pair of cargo shorts I wear all the time. It has a drawstring. It's perfect for eating competitions because it adjusts. Depending on how much your stomach expands, and it's very comfortable. So you want to wear loose clothing, and you want to wear stuff that's adjustable, and preferably stuff you don't mind getting dirty. It's not the cleanest sport.
Is there anything that people do with their bodies during a competition to help them?
Oh, definitely, yeah. There's a lot of action you take. It's not just putting food in your mouth and swallowing it. Considering technique, when you're in eating competitions, there's generally two things happening. One, you're eating, and one, you're drinking water. Generally, most competition will let you allow some kind of liquid consumption. So with one hand you're eating, with the other hand you're drinking, or for the case of hot dogs, you're like smashing things up and doing things. When you're getting full, there's also the consideration of gas stuck in your stomach because it tends to settle and you have these little pockets of air. So you'll often see a lot of guys jumping around or dancing. That actually helps a lot because what happens is it kind of collects all that pockets of air towards the top of your stomach so you can burp it out and make more room for food and liquids. The worst thing that could happen is someone throwing up on you, perhaps. One time I was in a cheesesteak eating competition. It was a sitting one, and we had a narrow walkway behind us. And this guy was just going to lose his shit in front of me. And he was next to me, and I had to quickly get up out of the way so he had enough room to go run to the trash can to let himself, For me, it wasn't considering just getting thrown up on. That would have been extremely unpleasant. But actually losing, because if he threw up on me, that would totally keep me from eating. Yeah, and I wouldn't be able to continue competing. So I couldn't win the contest. So
glory in sports comes from tons of adversity. I'm not sure about the glory of winning an eating competition with somebody else is sick on you. I don't know how that would work in a replay video.
We've had contests where they're doing it outside, obviously. And it occurs in the rain. It's like pouring rain and food is just sopping wet. And people still do it, because one, it actually helped because it made the food all easy to swallow. It's kind of disgusting. But it does occur, you just have to live with conditions and just go for it. Because when it comes down to it, it's sort of a race, It's not about the other people beside you. It's about you getting from point A to point B as fast as possible. There's nothing anyone else can do to intervene with your process.
Talking about races, when we were exchanging emails, kind of arranging a date to record, we touched on notions of competition. And I asked whether there were any kind of team-based events. And you mentioned that you had been in at least one.
Yeah, team events tend to not be that common because, it's hard to establish sort of a relay. I mean, I guess you could do a competitive eating relay or something where a bunch of guys often eat a lot together. One such thing we did, though, was this 50-pound pizza in Hollywood. Because the challenge is supposed to be 7 people, they eat this 50-pound pizza, and they get $1,000 to do so. Way we worked it out is, okay, we're not having 7 people do it. We're having 5 people do it. The owner upped the ante up to $1,500, which made it proportionate to how much more challenge it would be. So on this one, we kind of set up an event. We went against a bunch of amateurs over at Reckless Eating in YouTube. They eat a lot of gross stuff, but they're not competitive eaters like us. Basically, it was 100 pounds of pizza. You have 2 teams. It wasn't fair because they got 7 people and we got 5 or whatever. And we'd both attack it. And in that regard, yes, there was a bit of planning and strategy involved because we had to consider, picking up slack for whoever wasn't eating more, pacing ourselves so we wouldn't, get sick right away. And basically how we divided out the pizza. I mean, we weren't expecting them to miraculously pull it off because none of the guys, I think one guy ate like 3 or 4 pounds by himself. But, when you take 50 pounds of pizza, you divide it by 5 people, you're talking about 10 pounds a person.
Do you think there's scope to have kind of asymmetry? So if we let's look at StarCraft, an example. You have different units, and they're good for different things. So could you have a competition where one person was on beetroot and then another person was on custard, and you kind of built a team according to what you knew they would be good at?
Yes, that sort of competition can definitely be structured. I would probably more consider like the types of food. So let's say you had a relay. I would probably make one of the foods just not that much, but I would make it like 100 jalapeno peppers, You want the person without any kind of reservation about eating spicy food to go for that one because it's easiest for them. And let's say conversely, one of them was something really easy to consume. Let's say you had vanilla pudding, but you had to eat 15 pounds of it. You probably want the person with the largest capacity on that one. They may not be the fastest, but their capacity would be able to handle it. So yes, there's definitely certain specialties and skills that people can have in competitive eating.
Reason people like sports is because they can compare players and stats, and it's the same way that Madden comes out with a new game every year because they have different players to put into the game.
Yeah, I mean, if it ever got to that point, people could compare stats. You can make up metrics such as pounds per minute or tolerance for spiciness. It's a little bit more subjective in that regard because there isn't a standard way of measuring it, and probably that's the hardest thing to quantify in competitive eating because everything is so subjective. When someone says they ate 60 hot dogs, what does that mean? How does that translate to actual poundage? You don't factor in how much water they consume during the competition. You don't factor in how big the hot dogs are.
So let's say you're going to train for the habanero burrito, I think it was.
Yeah.
Or you're going to train for hot dogs. What would your kind of mindset and regimen be in the run up to the competition? How would you prep yourself?
Well, in any type of food, you want to practice with that type of food. Because generally, eating contest is an eating contest. I'll have a taco contest this weekend. I'll have a burrito contest in 2 weeks. It's not going to be that much difference. It's still going to be me eating a bunch of food. If it comes down to splitting hairs and you really want to get specific on technique, and it matters because let's say instead of a $500 competition, it's a $20,000 competition. It's worth investing the time to improve your metrics. Then there's the two things. Again, it boils down to capacity, which is innate. You basically have this ability to consume a lot of food, and then technique. Now, there's a couple things you can do to improve capacity. Every competitive eater kind of has their own little secret way of doing it, and some things work better, but it's not really discussed a lot. I think the one thing that we can all agree on is that water training is probably the most effective and least expensive way of increasing stomach capacity. A gallon of water is a little bit over 8 pounds. The human stomach can hold, at least I can hold about 1.5 gallons to 2 gallons, depending on how stretched I am. Let's say, tomorrow you drink a gallon of water, and the next day you drink 1.5 gallons, and the next day you drink a little bit more than that. So you kind of have this progressive increase in capacity if your body just gets used to accommodating that much fluid. Now, a lot of competitive eaters would debate, hey, that's not food, that's just liquid. And that's true, it isn't, because it passes through your system a lot faster. So you kind of have to do that quickly. Some guys would just go to a buffet. What I used to do before too is I would just go to all-you-can-eat salad bar and just count how many plates I ate. That wasn't very accurate because, it depends on what you put on your plate. So what I ended up doing is I just weighed myself before and after, which is actually a lot more accurate because that factors in all the liquids you've consumed, all the food you consume, and your total increase in poundage. And I've come to measure that the highest capacity I've ever done in that, it's about 14 or 15 pounds, and in a matter of 2 hours. But that's not 10 minutes. Usually competitions are like 10 minutes long.
Do you know or have noticed whether thin competitive eaters get treated differently to big ones, as though like the big ones have let themselves go more or something?
I've been on both ends of that, actually. When I first started doing this, I was a lot skinnier. And guys on my YouTube channel give me a lot of grief about gaining weight. I put on probably like 40 pounds. To get into a little bit of my own background, I've actually never been extremely thin. When I first started doing this, it was probably my thinnest point. It's because I've always had a problem with eating a lot of food. Before I started doing competitive eating, I actually used to weigh 300 pounds because I got used to eating a lot of food. and I used it as a kind of an emotional crutch. I would eat a lot of food. It made me feel better. And that's how I kind of inadvertently trained myself for this, because I was just used to accommodating a lot of food. Then I just had a bit of discipline. I took a couple of years, really just worked hard at training and then eating right. And then I went from 300 pounds about to 180. Yeah. Lately, in the last few years, I haven't been as strict with my regimen. I haven't worked out as much. I wouldn't attribute it as much to just doing competitive eating, though, because even when I was losing weight, I still ate a ton of food. I would probably consume maybe 30 or 40 pounds per week.
Right.
The only difference was I'd work out for 3 hours a night, So when you have these guys that are doing really well and they're thin, it's because they're working out a lot more.
I believe there's a reasonably successful competitive eater on the American circuit, a man who used to be anorexic. Is that correct?
That's right. Probably talking about Furious Pete. He's one of my buddies and one of my favorite people in the industry. He has a kind of a crazy story, and I think they made a documentary about him. He's from Canada, actually. He was anorexic. He was hospitalized. And I'll probably do a terrible job telling the story because I've only know kind of the gist of it. And he took on competitive eating as sort of a means to control like his body, that he can eat well and still not worry about his image issues. And he ended up being like really good competitive eater and become a bodybuilder. Fierce Pete, I would say, he's a little bit taller than me, and I don't know, he cuts and gains weight all the time too for bodybuilding shows and stuff. He has discipline, just like in any other sport. It comes down to how much you're willing to put into the training and into your schedule. Fortunately for competitive eating, you don't have to be super fit. It's nice, helps a lot, but you don't have to be to do it well.
So what you've said has kind of got me thinking about two things. One, whether your relationship to food has changed, and also whether, in a peculiar way, the competitive eating mindset that you have talked about, which is analysis, looking at pounds per minute, thinking of food in a clinical way and not necessarily an emotional one, could actually be good for people who want to control their weight or who want to take control of what they eat.
Yes, I believe that it is consideration that once you're in control of it, that you'll be in control of your body shape and how much you eat. It can definitely be a good tool for doing that because there's objective. The downside is a lot of people don't take that into consideration. They just kind of go into this sort of for the sideshow, hey, I'm at a bar, I can eat more wings than you kind of aspect. And it isn't. There's two schools of thought in that respect. There's people who consider it as a serious sport. I am on the cusp of considering it a serious sport because I've thought about it. What does it entail? This is something you're willing to invest your time in. You should do it well. The number one person that I've talked to that considers this a serious sport, and the most dedicated person I have talked to about it, is Takeru Kobayashi. Then the conversations I've had with him, he's explained that he's really die hard. He does this. This is like his livelihood. Every day, all his activities are tailored towards achieving a higher level as far as being able to consume large quantities of food and doing it quickly. There is that serious in it, and that's why his talent is just so much higher than the standard competitive eater. It's a standard deviation above everyone else's ability. Now, there's a lot of guys who just kind of scoff at it and go, okay, you know what, it's just a bunch of guys eating a bunch of food, and they don't take any seriousness to it. There's no training. And there's guys that can have some success in that, but they'll never be as good. And they'll never achieve the kind of, I guess, the accolades that he's achieved just because they don't take it as a serious sport. And I'm kind of leaning towards more on that side of the fence.
If people are interested in finding out more about competitive eating or seeing where events are or even trying out for themselves, what tips would you give them? What resources would you recommend?
One, please go to my YouTube channel, Johnnie Excel, which is Johnny like the Scotch, Excel like the software. And the most popular competitive eating website on the internet by far is our hub, eatfeats.com. It's mostly American, but they do have some challenges in the UK listed on there. Basically, you can look at, it's a resource for competitions and eating challenges. I'll go in there once in a while, look at places I can eat for free and do a YouTube video. One more consideration I want to throw out, and just to improve the popularity of competitive eating, for anyone interested in doing it, just take these metrics. If you can comfortably consume 2 kilograms of food, I would rank you in the top 20 percentile of the world as far as ability to do competitive eating. Now, 2 kilos really isn't that much food. You're talking about maybe 5 or 6 big double hamburgers or something, you know. Now, if you consume about 3 or 4, you're probably in the top 5% of the world. Those are the guys who should be doing competitive eating. I would say if you can do 2 to 3, it's not that impressive. You can probably win a couple small contests, but 3 or 4 puts you in the top, 5%. You can start going around, win some real money, go comfortably to these restaurant challenges and win. Because generally, they'll only be about 3 kilos as far as how much food you have to eat. So if you can do 3 to 4, you're safe. If you can do 2 or 3, train a little bit and see if you can get to 3 or 4. And if you can do 5 or 6 or more, you're a talent. You're the kind of person that will be at the top of the game.
So final question. Have you ever gone to a restaurant to practice and had people look at you because they didn't know what you're doing and they just thought you were a crazy man who ate too fast?
Yeah, that's I guess the good thing and the bad thing about this. You can go to a restaurant and people will just watch you eat. I've learned to be subtle. Like when I go to a salad bar, I'll just pick up 2 plates. That's reasonable. I won't bring out like a whole tray with 5 plates on it with piled high. And I just tend to just eat a lot over a short period or a long period of time. Now I've done this thing and I did a video on it. I went to Denny's and they have for $4 you can get all the pancakes you can eat. Just keep ordering more pancakes. He'll bring you down to get pancakes every time. And that wasn't very subtle after a while because the guy left the plates on the table, so I had like a stack of plates. I ended up eating like maybe 15 orders. I did I think 43 pancakes for $4, which is a great deal because that's a dime a pancake,
Yeah, food becomes cheaper the more you eat, pretty much.
Yeah, exactly. But you will get attention if you want. But for anyone seriously training, here's a tip: try to be subtle.
Yes. And so we come to the end of another show. My thanks to Johnny for coming on. And I also have some quick clarifications for you. The first one is about Kobayashi's arrest in New York. Apparently he was charged with 2 misdemeanors and 1 violation. And I believe that one of the misdemeanors was something like resisting arrest. So I think it's best to assume that the New York Police Department had their own good reasons for arresting him. The second thing is I mentioned the hamburger index. It's actually the Big Mac index, which is something that was developed by The Economist, so go and look that up. And finally, I missed out an ingredient in the full English breakfast, and that is fried mushrooms. You can't have a full English without fried mushrooms. Now, if you want to listen to more interviews or our gaming discussion, which is also quite unusual and eccentric in its own way, then you can check out the videos on the channel, or you can head over to HJ100.com. You can subscribe to the show on iTunes. We are there under Hatchet Job, and we are also on Twitter as Hatchet Job. So that's it from us. Thanks for listening, and remember, do your own research and draw your own conclusions.